So why don't we get started?
Okay.
Welcome everyone to today's Virtual Digital Economy Seminar. It's fantastic to see all of you again. Lots of regulars, some new people. Just fun to be back in the white seminar. The moderator today will be Reinhold Kessler from the University of Zurich. He will introduce our stellar speaker momentarily. Let me just remind you about the format. If you have any clarifying questions during the talk, please post them in the chat and Reinhold will manage the queue and unmute you so you can ask the question directly. And we'll also use the same channel to collect questions for the Q&A after the talk. A quick reminder, today's session will be recorded and we'll also leave it on YouTube. So if you do ask a question, then your question will also appear in the recording. Without further ado, very happy to hand over to Reinhold.
Yeah, thanks, Christian, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. Very excited to have Hong Lu here with us today. Hong is an associate professor of business administration at Harvard Business School, and she does research on firms' innovation incentives, managing intellectual property rights, and firm strategies in the market of innovative ideas. And one market she has been particularly working on is the movie industry, and recently she has begun to study how the Me Too movement led to a change in the creative production in this sector. And so I'm very much looking forward to today's paper, kind of continuing this line of research by hers. And without further ado, screen is all yours, Hong, and thanks for coming.
Thank you so much. I just got excited to see so many familiar faces. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this work in progress, which is in collaboration with my wonderful co-author, Laurina Zhang, who is also here. And this is the second paper about the impact of the Me Too movement. And it's so we're currently sort of experimenting quite a bit about the format, framing, as well as the structure. So I actually made some changes yesterday without even consulting with Laurina. So if there's any sort of glaring logical holes or loose ends, is all on me. All right, so I'll start with two data patterns, and I think which are not unfamiliar with many people who have been paying attention to these phenomena. Sorry. Oh, sorry, that's my husband. Sorry. Okay, so where am I? Okay, gender inequality. So despite huge progress in the last few decades about gender inequality, there's still remarkable gap in many sectors, in particular in creative, innovative, and entrepreneurial sectors that all of us deeply care about and have been studying. And there are two different but distinct phenomena. The first one is the female representation is generally low. So the left panel basically says women account for about 10%, 4% of film directors, 10% of the writers of top grossing films, about 10% of all the founders of VC-backed startups, and the US population of inventors. And the second related but different phenomenon is even conditional on people who participate in these innovative sectors, men and women also tend to work on different types of ideas. This is what we call gender segregation. And in particular, the right panel says that VC-backed startup founders are more representative in healthcare, education, and kind of other kind of servicing industries, but relatively few in manufacturing, finance, and IT. And for US inventors, they're already pretty not very represented in chemicals or engineering, biology, but they're scarcely there for engineering and some other disciplines. And for films too, writers often are more likely to be working on drama, romance, but not so much for action or horror movies and sci-fi. So let me state the research questions we ask first, and I'll explain why we want to study these questions. So we studied two research questions. One is, does the Me Too movement help reduce gender segregation in idea development? And second, perhaps as a consequence, how does Me Too movement affect the direction of ideas? And in particular, as we study in this particular paper, is about, does it affect the overall proportion of female-oriented ideas? And the context, not surprising to you, is we studied Hollywood producers' choice of the gender orientation of new movie projects set up before and after Me Too. So the first question we want to understand, we want to explain is, why do we care about gender segregation in addition to just general low female representation in the first place? And I think gender segregation is extremely important because it has potential short as well as long run impact on the efficiency of idea development. So if you look into sort of studying the literature on sort of underlying sources of gender segregation, different literature, like including like economics, sociology, and psychology, largely put the underlying sources into sort of two buckets. One bucket is sort of like about more sort of into the biases, constraints, and frictions. That is not because female talent don't want to do certain jobs, certain kind of jobs, but there's some kind of stereotyping or perception, misconception that they're not good at it. And if that's the case, if that's the primary reason in this particular context, you can imagine reducing gender segregation in the idea development may actually improve efficiency, even in the short run. But another bucket of reason could be is about comparative advantages or experiences or differences in sort of exposure and track record and experiences. But even for those sort of reasons, many studies in the literature would argue that those differences in comparative advantages, much of it is also related to long-run accumulative, lifelong potential bias and frictions and stereotyping, starting from how childhood, somehow how people were developed and perceived. So in that case, even if we may suffer some short-run potential efficiency loss or economic loss, in the long run, it may be for a good cause as well. And second, the reason we care about gender segregation is also because we also care about the types of ideas and products eventually reaching the consumers and get developed. So then you can imagine if we only have a policy that aim at, oh, it's okay if it will be fine as long as there are more women participating. Then you can imagine two different scenarios. One scenario where there are also complementary policies and efforts to also remove the frictions and barriers to sort of male types of positions and opportunities. Then you can imagine certain type of ideas that be developed by these more women participating in these domains, versus another scenario where you don't have these complementary policies or efforts. Then you will see a different kind of ideas and products developed by these more women talent allowed in. And the second, of course, is why Me Too then? So first of all, Me Too is among one of the most important social forces that currently we're experiencing today. And second, it also provides a relatively very large and relatively exogenous shock to the awareness and the public and national conscience about both the pervasiveness of sexual harassment, which is an extremely salient issue, as well as the deeper causes of gender inequality. So I'm sure everybody is quite familiar with the Me Too movement, but just so that everybody's on the same page. So the Me Too movement was started by Victoria Burke in 2006, but the hashtag Me Too movement didn't take off until early October 2017, when two news articles by New Yorker and New York Times published almost simultaneously about decades of sexual abuse allegations against Harvey Weinstein, which is extremely powerful producer in Hollywood. A few days after that, Alyssa Milano wrote on Twitter, "If you have been sexually harassed and assaulted, write Me Too" as a reply to this tweet. And that basically took the world by storm. So within 24 hours, the tweet was retweeted 40,000 times. And on Facebook, according to Facebook, more than 45% of people are friends with someone on Facebook that posted Me Too. And within a quarter, there's already academic a paper finding the reporting of sex crimes increased significantly afterwards. So as I said, the movement not only sort of make people more aware how pervasive harassment is, but also about its underlying deeper causes, which research has shown included the large gender disparities in representation, in pay, and perhaps more importantly, in power, as well as the entrenched gender norms and stereotypes. And together with the increased public and media scrutiny, these conversations and the increasing awareness potentially resonate with many people, including decision makers in the organization, as well as their various different constituencies and stakeholders and motivate change. And indeed, we have seen only a year later, New York Times reported that over 200 men in powerful positions were fired from job due to allegations of sexual misconduct, and 50% of the replacements were women. And in our first paper, which is forthcoming in Management Science, we find that Hollywood producers are significantly more likely to work with female writers after Me Too than before. And also there are like various many anecdotal evidence suggesting across different sectors the greater awareness of the role of gender stereotypes in determining and affecting sexual aggressive behavior in workplace as well as life and work outcome. For example, you have like high school teachers started to be very conscious about teaching gender stereotypes in the classroom, as well as judges at court making decisions actually taking into consideration of gender stereotypes. So the last question is why Hollywood? There are a number of reasons why we study this setting, but the most important is that it's because Me Too happened almost like to every single sector, like no sector is really sort of escaped the influence in some sense. So it is very, very difficult to find a control group. And there are also many different related, but different social trends that are happening around the same time. So tease out the facts specifically linked to Me Too is quite challenging. That's where Hollywood setting comes in, because this is actually a setting where we can be reasonably confident to distinguish a group of decision makers that we can argue that are more affected by the Me Too movement than another group of comparison decision makers. And in particular, this is the identification method we used in the first paper, which exploits the association with Harvey Weinstein to try to get this differential effect to say something more specifically and precisely about the effects of the Me Too movement specifically. And I think it's worthwhile just pause a bit and sort of talk through why we think Weinstein-associated producers may be more affected. And you can imagine multiple different reasons. And the first one is quite obvious and sort of natural based on both economics as well as sociology literature talking about the spillover effect, or in sociology calls OOT literature calls the stigma of association. So the basic idea is that like people have past collaborators with Harvey Weinstein might very well know better about, have more knowledge about his behavior, or because they share certain kind of traits, or at least sort of be influenced, or even if they're not, but they can be perceived by the market as sort of sharing certain kind of, or being more complicit in this problematic culture. So if this is the case, then past collaborators of Harvey Weinstein may have greater incentive to mitigate potential legal as well as market risk or manage their reputation. And the second set of reasons is, even if we don't think about incentives to sort of mitigate risk, even if they sort of won't be penalized by the market, even if they don't change, you can also imagine reasons why they may be intrinsically more motivated to change. And in the social psychology literature, as well as social movement literature, scholars have documented about the power of what they call moral emotions, for example, in particular guilt as well as sympathy. You can imagine have some association with Harvey Weinstein make people pay more attention and more cognizant about the issues raised by Me Too, and may sort of feel more motivated to make changes, especially pro-social changes. And just to be clear, the non-associate producers that we use as comparison group help to control for two sets of factors. The first sets are like the general trends, either social trends or demand and supply trends that are not related to Me Too movement. So we use the comparison group to at least tease out the common trends. And the second, of course, is they're also affected by the Me Too movement one way or another. So in that sense, we also take out the industry level of the Me Too movement. So to that end, I want to emphasize whatever we detect based on this differential impact by Weinstein association is not the total effects of Me Too movement, is this sort of differential effect. So just so that I don't get to finish, these are the core results of this paper. And the first is we do find that Me Too helps reduce gender segregation. So all of these results are due to are based on DID style kind of regression. So it's like a differential effect of Weinstein associated producers relative to the non-associated producers. So I won't repeat that because it's a mouthful. So in particular, relative to male writers, we find that female writers are less likely to work on female protagonist stories, which is our main measure of female-oriented ideas after Me Too than before. In other words, they're actually more likely to work on male-typed ideas after Me Too. And this effect on reduction in gender segregation offsets what we find in our first paper, that there are actually more female writers working on projects after Me Too, so that overall, we actually don't see any change in the overall proportion of female-oriented ideas. And the last things we find is that female protagonists are also more likely to be portrayed in a way that defy traditional gender stereotypes after Me Too than before. And we don't find any significant change in terms of how male protagonists are portrayed, in particular relative to traditional gender stereotypes. So these are the key results that I'll go into much greater detail later. So related literature, and the first literature we hope to contribute is extensive literature in economics, sociology, and psychology, both document gender segregation and also to explore the potential underlying causes. And we think our contribution are twofold. One is we do introduce the social movement and try to understand its impact. And second, we also join a small number of growing number of papers try to link gender inequality to the nature of ideas, the type of products and ideas and technology that actually get to reach the market to consumers. And the second, of course, by using Weinstein association, is very much related to the economics as well as OT and sociology literature on the spillover effects of scandals, accidents, and product failures. I myself has a paper on that as well. But that literature mostly talks about when scandal happens, what happens to the associated firms or parties due to third-party behaviors like consumers or stakeholders or financiers staying away. But relatively less studied is how firms actually respond to the scandal. So this is one of the area or angle we can make a contribution is to see how producers, the associated parties actually respond. And of course, all of this work built on extensive literature in sociology and OT on social movements, both in terms of extensive studies on the women's movement, as well as more recent studies about environmental employee protection, as well as community preservation on firm and corporation behavior. And the way we contribute to this literature, and I think it's like linking social movement to sort of the innovation, project selection, literature that don't really talk to each other. All right, some background. So just to be clear, making movies is a very long and uncertain process. And the point we look at is the very, very initial stage where we can systematically capture is when new movie project is set up. It's like when we first set up research project or something. And the way we identify it, as you will see later when I introduce the data, is by identifying when the scripts are transacted. So half of the scripts that are transacted in Hollywood are sort of mostly from complete scripts from screenwriters themselves, and half of them are sort of adaptations based on existing screenplay, existing novels or comic books, and then screenwriters are hired to adapt them into screenplay. So this is the point we actually focus on. So the key decision makers here are producers, and producers are just like partners of production companies or high-level studio executives in a movie studio. So if this is the point we focus, but if you think about it, like there's a long process before they can get produced and released. So on average, each movie project takes about 3 years or even longer. And about only 15% of all these movies will ever be produced and released in theater. So you can imagine a lot of potential other important industry stakeholders have to be persuaded to participate in this project for it to be successful. In particular, key talent like directors and acting talent as well as the most importantly, probably the financiers were mostly major studio executives. So their preference and expectation and their demand are in particular important for the decision for the producers at the point of setting up new projects. So conceptually, what do we expect Me Too to happen? And there are multiple different sort of forces that effects may happen, and it's not entirely obvious. For simplicity, I'm just going to make a statement and then tell you the two most important reasons why that statement, we think that statement may be true. And then I will talk about potential alternative mechanisms and effects later after I actually talk about the empirical research, which I think is probably more effective. So the first statement I'm going to make is not this, it's not on this slide. The statement is like, we expect Me Too to reduce gender segregation. That's like our first hypothesis. And I'll explain to you two reasons why we think that might be the case. The first is if Me Too help counteract gender stereotypes for women. And of course, an important premise is gender stereotypes are salient to start with in Hollywood. I don't have hard evidence, but if you look around just a bit in Hollywood anecdotally, they're everywhere, just anecdotal evidence. Female writers have long been documented about writing to their gender. And if you read reports and any sort of reports about the industry, you will see producers and studios, executives, it's very hard to convince them that women are capable of delivering films, major films that are successful with wide audience. And this is extremely new. I just did it yesterday. I tried to look at the released data and try to use the so-called outcome tests and see whether there's any sort of data evidence for biases or misconceptions or stereotyping, in the sense that for male types of movies, if there's certain kind of misconception, or it means that female writers have to overcome a higher hurdle, and as a result, they may eventually perform better or something. So this is a typical outcome test that you used to detect it. It's not entirely robust in this particular setting if you think about biases existing every single step of the way until the outcome. But what I do find for a different set of released movies, the reviews, both user review as well as professional reviews for male project stories that are released, that are written by female writers, are rated significantly higher than those by male writers on average. So this is, I'm still trying to look for other evidence, but this is something I did a little bit quick and dirty last time. But of course, if you think about theory and evidence, including empirical, including experimental evidence, is quite sort of rich in other contexts. And of course, Haleman, this is a 1983 paper on the lack of fit model, is extensively studied and cited in sociology, is exactly about this notion that based on this notion of gender stereotypes, where women are mostly portrayed as communal characteristics like caretaking, compassionate, while male characteristics are more like the getting work done kind of characteristics, assertive, aggressive, being a leader, etc. So in that sense, the kind of unfit between the sort of required characteristics of certain kind of jobs with the feminine characteristics make people make people tend to infer more negatively about women's ability to do certain kind of jobs or work on certain type of ideas. And this kind of model is repeatedly confirmed by experimental studies, more recently, few experimental studies. And of course, Katie Kaufman has also interesting experimental evidence on self-perception of gender stereotypes. It's not so much about I evaluate others that may suffer subject to gender stereotypes. I may evaluate myself too. So it's like women, my self-censor in terms of their ability or their initiatives to actually take on or answer male types of ideas or quizzes or questions. And after Me Too, it's possible that decision makers may become both more aware of potential gender stereotypes, the presence of them, and also both implicit and explicitly. And second, they may be more cognizant in terms of, and also be motivated to say systematically make more efforts to collect the information to reduce uncertainty or ambiguity so that they actually have more concrete evidence to overcome any sort of misconception that or the uncertainty associated with women's ability, or they may become more deliberate in their decision making. So all of these may help contribute to counteracting gender stereotypes. And on the same token of self-perception, female talents may feel more empowered or become more proactive in their search for opportunities in gender incongruent space. So though of these, everything on this slide is trying to say that like it is definitely plausible to imagine Me Too has an impact on gender stereotype. And a second reason I think may also help to reduce gender segregation is not necessarily due to sort of reasons related to gender stereotypes, is more about, for example, in our first paper, we find that because Me Too is about revealing the working conditions of female talent, and the most natural result is that we find that Me Too motivates producers to work more with female talent. But if this increased female representation is not combined with, say, sufficient increase on the demand side in terms of preference for female typed ideas, or if, say, in the short run at least, all the producers and Hollywood, like decision makers in Hollywood, or the entire system is set up to cater to or work on or more experienced with working on male typed ideas. And then at least in the short run, you would imagine there are more women now, but I'm more experienced or prefer to work on certain type of ideas, then I may employ these women, female talents, more on male typed ideas. So that itself is not so much about mitigating stereotypes, but it's just relative costs and benefits of allocating and rematching the gender of the talents versus the gender of ideas. Regardless of these reasons, we'll say something about it later in terms of data. We think both are likely to be present. But regardless of the reason, we expect that relative to male writers, female writers are more likely to work on male types of ideas after Me Too movement. And if this is the case, as I said before, consequently, the overall effect of the Me Too's impact on the overall proportion of female-oriented ideas is ex-ante ambiguous. Despite what we find in the first paper, there are more women, female writers working in this space. And the second hypothesis is we expect Me Too to lead to fewer stereotypical female-oriented ideas, meaning like female characters or female protagonists are less likely to be portrayed in a traditionally stereotypical way. And we are interested in this particular hypothesis for two reasons. The first reason is it is inherently interesting thing that we're curious to see. The second reason is that we do want to have a sense about how important or how plausible the first mechanism of counteracting or battling gender stereotype is. And if that's the case, we do want to sort of have some secondary sort of prediction to be confirmed, to provide confirmatory kind of evidence as well, in the sense that we do want to actually see some changes related to gender stereotypes. A natural place to look at is how women characters and ideas are actually portrayed and characterized. So data and method. So the data comes from Dandy Approach, the database that I used for a long time from my job market paper. And it's a database of script transactions and adaptation contracts. And what we do is first exclude a set of projects. We exclude projects by Weinstein Company, as well as 17 producers who are later accused of sexual misconduct themselves, as well as projects that miss writer, producer, and logline information. And the reason we exclude those projects by Harvey Weinstein is just like for people who are directly implicated, the disruption is a bit probably too large. For example, Weinstein Company went for bankruptcy. It's just not terribly relevant in terms of the type of outcome variables we look at. So whatever we look at, it's about the association spillover effects from Weinstein to past collaborators. And in the end, we have about 4,000 new movie scripts that began about 3 years before Me Too and 2 years afterwards. So the first thing we need to do is to allocate the projects into treatment versus comparison groups. And the way we do that is just look at because producers usually work in teams, we just look at every single producer in a team associated with a focal project. The analysis will be at the project level. And we go to IMDb and look at whether this producer has had past collaborations with Harvey Weinstein. In particular, Harvey Weinstein being the producer, and this focal producer has assumed one of these 4 major roles: producer, director, writer, actor, or actresses. And for unique producers, 17% of the unique producers in my data set were themselves past collaborators with Harvey Weinstein. It's like, you can see, like, Harvey Weinstein is extremely influential in the space. But then, because the analysis is at the project level, we aggregate everything up to the project team level. So we define project as associated with Weinstein if at least one of the producers had past collaborations with Weinstein. And of course, later on, we do robustness check by also using a more continuous measure of the intensity of collaboration, meaning like how the number of past collaborations you have of producers of the entire production team. And we use a DID style regressions where we compare the 2 different groups of projects. And the first thing we have to clarify is that Weinstein associate producers are not random. They're significantly more experienced, more established, have greater industry connection, both with the studios as well as major talent agencies in Hollywood than associate producers. So to avoid the confounding factor of quality, of producer quality, we use a matched sample. Essentially, we match the treatment group to a one-to-one matching to a comparison project in a comparison group based on a whole set of producer characteristics, so that they're observationally at least similar. And of course, they all compete in the same market. So it's not a strictly DID in the sense that their outcome are not affected or correlated to each other. So whatever results we get, we need to interpret it incorporating this competition effect. It's possible that Weinstein associate producers compete away certain kind of talent or certain type of ideas away from non-associate producers. And the key measure, so the first set of results we want to look at is what we call gender orientation. So the way we define gender orientation conceptually is from the audience point of view, is whether it's a project is more likely to be liked by a women audience versus a male audience. And the primary measure we use is actually very simple, is the gender of the protagonist of the story. And we codify that data from what we call the log line, is just 2 or 3 sentences kind of description of a storyline. And that is we don't have access to scripts systematically. So the 2-sentence storyline is the only sort of textual information about the content that is systematically available for very, very early stage movie projects. About 70% of them, you can manually code them pretty clearly just by looking at the gendered pronouns as well as sort of the name, which is clearly, so Alice is clearly women, Mark is clearly man. And about 30% of the log lines are just not as clear because we ask RA not to make assumptions based on profession or sort of relatively gender neutral names. So with the other 30%, we use sort of a supervised machine learning method using a training set of the 70% that we can actually more clearly categorize to actually further codify them into male versus female protagonist. And also we of course do robustness check, excluding the 30% that are not manually coded at all, and show that results are robust. And of course, like if you read film studies, like working for film scholars, the first criteria they use to define, their set of criteria they use to define as women's film or film that are more likely to attract women. The first one is almost always whether it's a women's story. It's like the lead character, the central character is a woman. But then we do want to do a little bit more in terms of verify whether this is a reasonable proxy for sort of gender orientation from the demand perspective. We do 2 things. The first thing is that we go to mTurk and use a survey to actually solicit more directly about demand-based preference. So what we do is for each of the 4,000 log line, we asked 15 M-Turkers. We have to ask each of them 2 questions. One is, based on this log line, how much do you think a typical man in the US will like this movie? And the second question is, how much do you think a typical woman would like this movie based on this log line? And then, of course, there's 1 to 5 scale, and then you do pairwise t-test. And that t-test stat can allow you to categorize the movies into 3 buckets. Those that are significantly more likely to be appealing to men, those significantly more likely to be appealing to women, and a large bucket is in the middle, almost 50% of them in the middle, which is not surprising given how difficult to actually predict and also like relatively sparse information we have from the log line. But this measure is highly correlated with the gender of the protagonist. If you, for example, about 80% of female protagonist stories are more likely to be rated as significantly more likely to be appealing to women, and only 8% of them are for male protagonist stories. And the second thing we do is to go to the real data. And in particular, we use Rotten Tomato review data for both critics reviews, like professionals, as well as the user reviews. But of course, the subject to all sorts of selection problem. But that's the best we can get in terms of individual level rating for which the individuals can also be codified with gender. So we codify the critics and reviewers as gender, their gender using genderize. So what we find is that for these this separate released movies, data set released movies, relative to male reviewers, female reviewers are more likely to rate female protagonist stories more favorably than male protagonist stories. So which is also consistent with the idea that female protagonist stories is likely to be more appealing on average to women audience. And later on, we also use alternative measures in our regression. One is the demand-based measure that we generate from the M-Turk survey. The second one is a dummy, actually, just simply indicating female genre-only film, which is a much coarser measure in our view, but both also provide consistent results.
Maybe one question on the data before moving to the results. So Luis is asking whether the prediction is also correlated with the M-Turk responder's gender.
Yes. I think there's, if I remember correctly, this is a while ago, I think there's some slight correlation with the MT responder's gender. And the way we don't have to worry so much about it is the pairwise t-test is essentially sort of teasing out the person fixed effect. So in that sense, using that as a codifying regime is probably not terribly concerning. Absolutely. So the first result is the answer to the second question first. It's really easier to present. The first result I'm going to show you is just like, think about the outcome variable here is overall proportion of female-oriented ideas of our sample. And we wanted to see whether there's an increase in sort of the likelihood of it being female protagonist stories. And the raw data here, first of all, it's raw data. The raw data basically shows you that before and after, there both seem to be an increase between these two groups, but there's not much difference between the groups. So the DID is not significant. And that's consistent with what we have in the first 2 columns, which is just in regression form, where relative to non-associate producers, the Weinstein associate producers do not have differential change in their overall likelihood of developing a project that features a female protagonist, meaning there's just not much change, not much differential change by Weinstein association in terms of the direction of ideas after Me Too versus before. So that's like the first set of results, which is kind of interesting if you think about in our first paper, this is a replication of the first paper, we find that Weinstein associate producers were almost 9 percentage points more likely to work with female writers. So that's like almost 35% increase relative to their baseline. So it's a very large increase, but we don't see more female-oriented ideas. But if you break it, so this is just like time-specific results quarterly to show there's not much pre-trend, and then there's not much anything later. It's just no result for this one. And then if you break things down in terms of female versus male writers, then you see a difference. You see why we don't see the overall proportion of female-oriented ideas change. If you look at the first two columns, the first column basically only look at the subsample of male writers, and the second column looks at the subsample of the project with female writers. So the DID results, even though they're not precisely estimated, you can see that for the male one, is almost zero. It means like there's not there's no differential change in the direction of ideas, the nature of the ideas by Weinstein association after and before Me Too. But the DID coefficient of the second column is very negative and economically large, and is the p-value is about 0.12. So basically it says that relative non-associate producers, female writers on projects with Weinstein associate producers are less likely to work on female-oriented ideas, meaning they're more likely to work on male-oriented ideas. And the third column essentially just combine the first column in the triple differences regression, and that gives us more power, and the triple diff coefficient is negative and highly significant, meaning relative to male writers, female writers of Weinstein associate producers are more likely to work on male types of ideas, like in the gender incongruent space. And I'll do a little bit further breakdown, which I think is interesting to report because there's even sharper difference. So the previous two subsample is breakdown by the gender of the writer. And this one, I do another further breakdown also by the gender composition of the production team, meaning I break things by 4 teams by whether, so the first column is all of the writers and all of the producers are men. And the other 3 columns are basic different combinations of having at least one writer, one female writer, one female producers, or both female writer versus female producers. And the sign of the coefficient is quite interesting, is that if you look at the only positive and large coefficient is the first one. And every other one of the 3 groups, they're all large, economically large, and relatively less precisely estimated. And I'm terribly mismanaging the time. All I'm saying is that we do see reduction in gender segregation, even for female producers. Even female producers are among sort of initial decision makers. They can also be subject to, and anecdotally they are, potential gender stereotyping or a misconception or perception about like they're just lack the experience to do male typed ideas. And we also see them doing more in the after Me Too than before. And also the reduction of gender segregation seems to be in both directions. The first step, we also see all male writer and production team also do more female-oriented ideas. So you have reduction, and then you have reduction change in both directions. And this is just a triple diff regression. I'm running out of time. I'm not going to dwell on. So in my remaining 5 minutes or 4 minutes now, the second set of results I'm going to tell you is also quite interesting. So remember, like we are interested in this both because it's interesting, but also because we do think, even though we can't pin down precisely, or it's probably not the entire story, is this notion of counteracting gender stereotypes. And then we want to see whether it's manifested somewhere else. So what we did is to use machine learning method to use them with the logline information to actually construct a measure that can measure whether a particular logline is portrayed relative to the traditional female stereotype or relative to the traditional male stereotype. And the benchmark anchor characteristics we use come from the BEM sexual inventory in sociology, have been long and hard studied and replicated in sociology. Basically, they have 20 masculine characteristics and 20 feminine characteristics. They're all positive values, at least in the 70s, but it's just rated as more desirable for men versus women, or vice versa. And we convert these using the BERT model to the vector space, and take average of these 20 vectors and use them as the anchor, and then convert the logline of any logline into another vector and basically project it to the direct line connecting these 2 benchmarks. So then the measure you constructed is basically the distance to the male characteristics divided by the entire length of the male and female anchor points. So basically, if you fall in the middle, then it's relatively mutual. If it is a positive measure, it's more closer to the traditional feminine stereotype. And if it is negative, it's closer to the traditional male stereotype. And as the first time machine learning user, I'm actually quite pleasantly surprised about how well it actually works. So we do a bunch of validation tests. This one is essentially say, there's a pretty monotone relationship between this measure, meaning like positive is closer to female, with respect to the proportion of stories rated with this level of this gender role measure, that the proportion of female protagonists. So there's a pretty positive relationship with respect to that. And we also stare at some of the actual storylines and look at distribution of the different distribution position percentile of this measure and see whether it actually makes sense just by looking at it. And we are pleasantly surprised to find like Captain Marvel, which is a very nice film, is rated as 15th percentile, is closer to sort of masculine side. And Girl on the Train, which I haven't seen, but Laurina really likes it. She confirms that it's closer to the sort of 85th percentile, is more traditional, not more traditional, but it's not kind of masculine type of story. And the result is basically this. If you just look at these two coefficients, is if you look at stories, these are new projects. Stories featuring female protagonists, they're significantly less feminine. They're significantly more likely to be closer to the masculine characteristics. While if you look at men, the stories of male protagonists, there's no change. So even though it's a little bit disappointing, because I do actually hope to see some positive change there in terms of they're more open to develop more like feminine, more compassionate male stories, but it's also comforting to know that sort of if Me Too is primarily about gender norms about women, then it's not terribly surprising that we don't find much change for how male protagonists are portrayed. Finally, I also want to show you a little bit about what we can learn about demand. First of all, I want to say it's very difficult to tease out demand change specifically associated with Me Too movement, because we just don't believe that Weinstein association works on the demand side, because it's very difficult for consumers to really figure out who is behind the scene and let alone who is associated with Harvey Weinstein, even though it is relatively easier for the industry insiders to figure that out. So in that case, what we show you is only a comparison of male protagonist stories versus female protagonist movies, released movies. This is using a different data set of released movies, comparing movies released before and after Me Too, and see whether like consumer response, both in terms of rating as well as box office, has any change. And we have two interesting results. One is we just don't find any change simply comparing male protagonist versus female protagonist stories, which seems to suggest, at least in the short run, this is very imprecise, because these preferences are also based on movies that are released after Me Too, meaning they were developed way ahead of Me Too. So quality and characteristics of these movies are already fixed before Me Too. But regardless, we don't seem to change in the short run in terms of the market demand for these two segments. But what we do find is that for stories featuring female protagonists, those that are more masculine seems to be more preferred. So this is a feminine interaction. So it's negative, meaning like people seem to prefer female leads that are more masculine portrayed. So in that sense, it's consistent with what we find in terms of producer decision to reduce gender stereotypes for female protagonist stories. And this is the second but last slide, is just some, like, there were different mechanisms that could pushing these results. There's some we can tease out, but some we sort of leave it here so far as plausible mechanisms. The first one is the possibility that Me Too does help to counteract gender stereotypes is consistent with almost all of our key results. And the second one is also possible, is just the idea that you do want to work more with women, but there's no sort of large shift in terms of market demand in these two segments, and you need to employ these women somewhere, then you're probably more likely to work with them on male-typed stories. This is also a plausible reason. And of course, we also see sort of a reversing direction of all male teams working on more female stories, which is likely to be the case that, for example, if it is after Me Too is more reluctant for female talent to work with all male production teams, then it's probably easier for them to work with male writers, but then write more female themed stories. It's like slightly less costly, easier to do as a response, which is one way to explain that result. What we can rule out is these two reasons. One is there's one thing we don't want to happen, I don't want to see, is that Weinstein and social producers, the reason their female writers writing more male stories is mainly because they select the type of female writers who used to and more experienced in writing male stories in the first place. Then it's more about selection story rather than these female writers are writing different type of stories. So we provide some evidence suggesting this is not the reason for what we find. And similarly, we also don't find that the Weinstein social producers are more or less likely to be more experienced with male type stories with female writers as well. So those are what we can rule out. Finally, conclusion. We do find that Me Too has reduced gender segregation in idea development and led to a less stereotypical portrayals of female protagonists. And there are many, many limitations. One of them, and mainly because of the short duration of the study. So a lot of the effects are short-run effects. We can't really say much about long-run effects. And second, importantly, is because it's not like if we wait for another like 2 or 3 years for movies, for projects set up after Me Too to have enough time to be released and produced, we will actually see whether they're actually released and what is the final outcome and how resource allocations are made. So in that sense, we actually, using these outcome data can help us better differentiate the mechanisms, whether it's due to misconception and stereotype, or sort of you need to incur some short-term sacrifice in doing this particular kind of pairing. And lastly, I want to conclude by saying Hollywood, of course, is not representative of all sectors out there in the economy. There are some particular characteristics. One is it's particularly salient. It's just like highly attractive to media attention in the first place, and it's the epicenter of the Me Too movement. So in some sense, it is kind of a higher bound of what we may find in terms of effect on Me Too because of lots of attention. And second, there are lots of opportunities to change because all the projects, like new projects constantly being set up, and these are relatively short-term projects, so it's not permanent positions. So in that sense, the opportunity and cost of change is also relatively lower in Hollywood. And thirdly, which is in terms relates to gender segregation, is it's not very difficult to think that you use female talent to work on male type of ideas, in a sense, even though they're relatively less experienced in this particular kind of stories, but the skill set and experience is probably more or less transferable. But if you think about like scientists who have been trained for years to work in engineering versus biology, it's probably very difficult to actually switch them to different segments or different type of projects in the relatively quickly. So basic to say, in other settings, you may observe different results. In settings where you get less attention, media attention or public pressure, or you have more prominent positions you have to fill and there are fewer opportunities to change, or in situations where the male versus female type of segment requires skill sets that are very, very difficult to accumulate and translate, you may observe that either the impact on the Me Too is relatively limited, or even if we see more opportunities for women, they may be more likely to concentrate in the female segment of the space rather than the male type of space, that as we do see in this paper. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Hong, for this very interesting talk. There are some questions, and we will start with Larry White. Even though your co-author already answered to that question, maybe he wants to elaborate on his comment.
Yeah, so some 800 movies.
Sorry. You toward the end, you mentioned, I think, 759 films that you were working with, and I think your study covers 5 years, 2015 through 2019, and that seemed like a small number of releases over those 5 years.
I wouldn't call them small number. If you think about it, it's more than 120 films released in theater each year then it's not a huge number, but it's not a small number, I would say, either.
Gee, I would have thought, those data I don't have them at my fingertips. I would have thought there were 400 or 500 per year.
Yeah. So I tease out. Yeah, exactly. So we tease out a lot of independent films, relatively small films, because of lack of information as well as lack of Rotten Tomato reviews. So you can think of them as a selected sample, but relatively larger films. Yep, absolutely.
All right, thank you very much. The next question is by Jeremy Haas, and I will unmute you real quick.
Yeah, thanks for your great presentation. I had a question regarding, it's a bit related to Luis Cabral's question, regarding the downstream market. So in terms of distributors, since there is during this time also new distributors with that are buying lots of scripts and producing lots of movies, do you see heterogeneous effects between maybe major studios and new actors such as the SVOD platforms?
Let me think. So I would say that my sample is more selected towards major studios and large companies. So that's most, I think if there is selection effect, sample selection, that's more type of movies I do. So in that sense, I don't think I can say much about the SVOD platforms. But I think we did some split between major studios and indies. Either major studios were actually bigger driver in the change, or they're not terribly different from each other. I don't recall it very precisely, but I do remember major studios were bigger, were part of the major drivers, because we remember the economic significance as being quite big. If they don't change, then we don't. They're really the driving force in this industry. We do hope them to be actually changing rather than only driven by indie films.
All right. Next question would be by Joel Waldvogel. Gonna mute you.
So I'm reading Joel's comment.
Wonderful. So thank you for the interesting talk. My question is about supply versus demand, and it's related to Larry's concern about the numbers. I mean, there are 20,000 feature movies released in the US over this 5-year period, not all into theaters. But the question is, are you interested in the demand for female written scripts by big time producers, or are you interested in the supply of genre scripts, by gender? And it seems like, I think the answer is you're interested in the demand, but then I kind of wonder, what about the rest of the movies, since the market's being served not just by these movies, but by literally thousands and thousands of others?
So I think so there are several pieces of this question. One is the demand side. I'm interested in the demand side. And then I think we can say more about the demand side than the supply side for the following reasons. So first of all, the demand side will segment into the end consumers, as well as what I call the intermediate customers, which are studios and talent. And because the decision point that I look at is when production companies, producers initially set up project. In that sense, many of the key talent and studio executive, the industry stakeholders, in some sense is kind of the demand chain, right? Like they will not get on board until like a few months later at least. So when Me Too happened, not only end consumers may have conscious shock or any potential change in their demand, all these intermediate industry stakeholders also have change in their demand, either due to intrinsic or due to extrinsic reasons. Manage reputation to avoid risk, or just conscious shock. So they want to make change. So in that sense, their demand change will shift the economic calculation of the producers when they decide on what kind of projects to actually set up and what kind of talent to actually work with. So in that sense, to me, it's more like a demand sort of chain. And I would probably want to say the industry stakeholders' demands, if I can call it, is probably more economic important, more immediate, which is also consistent with much of the CSR literature that the way I understand it is like end consumers, even though it sounds important, but in the end, the data are much more mixed versus stakeholders like employees are much more powerful in terms of influencing change. And as to supply, I think there are definitely changes in supply. It's just very, very difficult for us to actually pin them down, because the earliest systematic observable point is when scripts are sold, at least in my data set. Then sold is a kind of equilibrium outcome between both demand and supply. But we can say something about, for example, in our first paper, do the increase in female opportunities for female writers only concentrate in, say, established female writers or relatively novel female writers that have no major experience before? We see both and increase. So in that sense, there may be some increase in supply, but I don't know, first of all, and second, probably not in the short run. So if any short run gain, probably already people who are in the market, is just very few of them will be ever selected to work with these producers anyhow in the first place. So in that sense, the margin happens at the selection. It's more about selection.
Right. Maybe one last question by Luis Cabral, who has a related comment.
Well, it's actually more than related. I think it's really the same one. I should have read Joel's question before. Yeah, I was kind of intrigued by pretty much the same question. I mean, one possible narrative, just to kind of repeat a little bit what was said, is that Me Too kind of changed a sort of collective perception of women about their own identity, or whatever you want to call that, and that's been reflected in the supply of movies. But then supply follows demand, not the other way around. And men and women can equally well produce that product that appeals more to women post Me Too. So that's one narrative that's very different from one you have in here. And I'm not sure that was exactly Joel's question, but at least that was the way I was thinking about that. And that's different from the supply effect of, women did not have role models in producing certain types of movies, and now that's changing, and that creates an entry process that may even be self-sustaining, because all of a sudden we have role models and women who do this sort of movies, and that completely changes the nature of the supply. That's a very different narrative. Not completely clear to me how to tease them out, but I find that fascinating. I mean, I think this is really cool. Basically.
Thank you. Yeah, any supply, I would stop here, but any supply side is definitely interesting to tease out. It's just, I think that requires longer run observation than a couple of years. And so if you think about hundreds of thousands of scripts and thousands of new writers enter Hollywood every year, only a very, very small percentage point will actually get into my sample. So in that sense, even sort of that is the margin that I'm looking at, and that is margin in some sense is quite important as well. And I saw Joe's question, then I have to worry about which movies are made by the remainder of the producers. Yes, so we do see in both projects, we do try to look at the entire sample we can get from this database, which is more definitely more than what I have in the matched sample. But the only thing I would say is that then we just have to sacrifice a little bit in terms of what we can say, in terms of more precisely about whether this is about Me Too, because there's so many things happening before and after. And when you use Weinstein association, it just restricts the type of comparison group we can actually, the apple to apple kind of comparison we can make. And when we wanted to actually talk more specifically about Me Too, so yes, limitation and sacrifices, think about what happens elsewhere.
All right. That's great. Thank you very much, Hong, again, for this very interesting talk and all discussions and comments by the audience. Also, thank you very much to that. And now, before we wrap up, Christian has also something to say.
Yeah, thanks also from my side. I just want to make a quick announcement before we close. The next White seminar continues in 2 weeks. Our speaker will be Maria Petrova from Pompeu Fabra. That's on November 18. Thanks everyone for coming and for the lively discussion. Thanks, Hong. Great paper, and see you all in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.